Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for Decoding a Genomics Report. We're going to talk today about how we can use our cow's DNA to improve her offspring and to be able to select bulls and to give us an idea when we're buying a cow what to expect from her, or even what a heifer is going to do before she's ever in milk or even bred. Okay, so this is the genomic report we're talking about today. You'll see on this particular one in the top right, it says what kind of genotype it is. Currently, the one being utilized is the 100K, but it will look like this. And so we're going to talk about how you get that and what you do with it when you've got it. All right, so Purebred Mini Jersey Society is here for those people who want to make sure that their mini Jersey is actually a miniaturized Jersey. That is what we breed and what we register. And the way that we prove that is through using these genomic reports. They come with what's called a breed-based representation score. That's the BBR that you may have heard talk about. As the Purebred Mini Jersey Society, our mission is that we want to make sure that owners are working together and that they have all of the resources that they need to be able to breed every generation to be better than the one that was previous. And we do that by education, through mentoring, through working with the board of directors, and being able to have someone to bounce ideas off of and to teach you the information you may be missing, and just through our community at large. We have a lot of ways that you can network within the community because we all need each other to be able to do what we're doing. So about me, I own Northwoods Homestead with my husband. We are in North Idaho. We brought our very first cows home in 2012, and they were Jerseys, unregistered, pure Jerseys. It was later proven through DNA testing. They both had heifers, and then I sold off one of the cows because milking two at the time was by hand was a lot for me, having just started out. So I totally understand when you're beginning how overwhelming things can be. Having those two cows in milk was really overwhelming. So I sold one and eventually sold one of those two heifers and kept a cow and heifer, and they both ended up having heifers, and my herd just expanded from there. And it has grown every year. We're up to about 11 right now. We'll be at about 16 by the end of the year. So I love these cows, and I am very passionate about sharing what we do and why we do it and how we do it. Okay, so what your cow is, what she can be. There's a lot of things that influence that. Some of that's going to be environmental, and it would have to do with your weather, the kind of property you have, the way that you manage and handle her. And some of it you don't have as much control over because it's genetics. Um, that has to do with things like her color, her temperament, even. It could be things like how fertile she is. There's some influence you can have on these things, but there's not always a lot of influence. Of course, things like production, you can influence by how you feed her, how much of those kinds of things like alfalfa or grains that you give her can increase her production, as well as giving things like black oil sunflower seeds can produce higher fat in her milk. But some of that's just going to be genetics. So using our genomic testing, we can figure out if your cow is exactly what you want, or if there's some influence you can have by breeding her to a bull that will make improvements where you want, where you need them. And it also makes sure that your offspring are worth the most possible. It helps you achieve your goals much faster because you know exactly what you're looking at. I like to equate it to when you're house shopping. You drive down the street, you see the house, it's a beautiful house. You know, the yard's all landscaped, you've got flowers, the front door's freshly painted, everything looks great. But until you look in the windows, you don't really know what's inside. So genomics are like a peek in the window at our cow to see what genomics she's carrying, what kind of genes she has, and what she's going to do. Helps you to figure out what she's going to pass on, essentially. Some of the other things you can do with genomic testing is you can verify her parents, or if there are missing parents and they were previously genotyped themselves, those matches by DNA can be made. And we can figure out if there's any genetic defects you might be carrying. We get things like inbreeding percentage, genomic inbreeding percent, tells you how much DNA she has that is repeated, how many of the alleles are repeated, and that can clue you in on inbreeding. We don't really pay too much attention to things like the pedigree inbreeding. A lot of times there are missing animals in our pedigrees because not all mini Jerseys are registered with the AJCA, the American Jersey Cattle Association. All right, let's get right into that report. Now, it's important to know that some of the terms we're going to use here belong to the AJCA. They are trademarked by the American Jersey Cattle Association or by the CDCB, which is the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding. And those are who own the tests that give us the genomic results that we see on those reports like that. So in order to get that report on your cow, once you have your cow, you need to have her recorded in the American Jersey Cattle Association. So the first step is to give them a call and get a number to set up an account. That doesn't cost anything, and you have to do that over the phone. Then you're going to record her. She's not necessarily registered because remember, she probably doesn't have any pedigree behind her. And to be registered, she needs to have some pedigree. So you'll do that by using that number and then creating an account at infojersey.com. So if she does have a registered parent, you're going to use that when you do that recording online, when you fill in the form. If she doesn't, there are generic terms that you can use to fill in those blanks. A generic term, a code, basically, that you're going to put in for the parent that is missing or if both are missing. Then you're going to order your genomics test. You're going to find that underneath the services tab in genomics. Females will cost you $47, but males, bulls, will cost you more. There's a $100 fee added by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding. That is not anything that PMJS has any control over, but sometimes we can give you a grant to help out with that fee to help you get a bull recorded and get genomics for him. You're going to send in a DNA sample. That's really simple to do. It's only tail hairs that you're going to pull. You need about 30 of those, and you can get those by wrapping your finger around about 10 or 20 hairs at a time and giving a good yank. Sometimes they don't even notice it, and you can do it as young as a calf that is just dried off, or you can do it on an older cow. It doesn't make any difference. Just be careful not to touch the bulb end of that hair because that is where the DNA is, and you don't want to contaminate that. So it's best if you put it straight into either a sandwich bag or for longer term storage into a paper envelope. You don't need to seal it. You just put it in there. Make sure you label your envelope and then don't touch that root hair. You're going to send that in on a form that you're going to print out once you make your order. And the results take anywhere from 4 weeks to sometimes a month, 2 months. They are slow to get those official results out. And those are the ones that contain the BBR that we're after. So those are only reported the first Tuesday of every month. So if you miss 1 month, you got to wait a whole nother month. I've learned to be a very patient woman. If you get your preliminary results, that's usually pretty quick, somewhere right around that 3 and 4 week mark, then you know that the following month is when your test is going to be out with the BBR. If it falls in August, they do report later in August. So yes, a couple of kind of reports, different places on. When you log in the report on the right, the performance and progeny report is what you're going to see for every animal that is recorded there with the AJCA. It's full of codes and numbers, and it can be super confusing, and I'm hoping to shed some light on that for you today. If this particular one is a bull, but if this were a cow, at the bottom of the page, you could see possibly milk reports that were sent in if she comes from a large dairy that is doing that testing. That is all recorded as part of her registration. Progeny would be recorded there, meaning all of her offspring would be recorded if they're registered. You may notice sometimes that there's a heifer, a bull, and then a couple of years being skipped. And what that would likely mean is that she had bulls or heifers that are not registered. It can mean that she didn't breed those years, but that's unlikely. It's usually that those animals were not registered. It also lists the owner of the cow, so you can sometimes see how they've passed hands and where they came from and who bred them. Her age will be on there, all that kind of information. And you can see how on that report that's in blue, the Genomic Evaluation Report, the things that are color matched, that is the same information, no matter which of these two reports you're looking at. So we're going to break it down a little bit for you. There are some links at the bottom there. If you get a hold of these slides, you'll be able to link to those and read more information. Okay, let's get into the report. All right, some basics that you're going to need to know are some of the acronyms, and we're going to break those down through this whole lesson. So we are using currently the 100K genotype. That's the density of the chip, the test that they're using. And there are different levels. It started when I first started testing, it was 9,000 alleles, and now we're all the way up to 100,000. And it is expanding. And I found that some of the animals I tested with the 45K are throwing offspring that are slightly lower with the 100K. So you do need to be aware that once you test an animal, you never have to test them again, but it is possible as that density gets more intense, it gets more sensitive to what the DNA is, then the offspring may be slightly lower than you anticipate. But what we're doing is we're cleaning out the gene pool for the animals that don't have Jersey DNA. So it's all a step towards improving. The AJCA, of course, is the American Jersey Cattle Association. BBR is that test percentage of Jersey DNA. Now we're looking at the JH1 and the JNS. Those are going to be explained a little bit later, but specifically they are some genetic defects essentially that we don't want to have in our cattle. So it'll let us know if their animal is a carrier, or if it's an F, that means they're free, they're not a carrier. The CDCB is the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding. And ET, if you see that after the name, you'll see the animal's name -ET. That means that they were an embryo transfer. That'll be one of the somewhat common ones that you may see. There are some other terminology that's similar to that that you're really not going to see very often. Of course, JH1 is one of those genetic defects that is associated with infertility. JNS is Jersey neuropathy with splayed forelimbs. I've got a picture for that coming out for you. If you see JX before the animal's registered recorded name, that means that they are a Jersey cross. So there is somewhere in their pedigree within 6 generations a known cross. At the 7th generation, that JX falls off. And that's a generation count. It doesn't necessarily have to do with some of the other things that are related to how many generation counts there are. P is heterozygous for polled, meaning that they carry one polled gene. The other gene, of course, would be horned. If they have a -PP after their name, that means that they are homozygous polled. They carry 2 polled genes. They inherited one from each of their parents. So whenever they're bred, they will pass on one of those 2 genes. There's only 2, one from mom, one from dad. So they will pass one of those on, and all of their offspring will be polled because they only need to have one polled gene to be polled. It blocks the horn growth. PTA means predicted transmitting ability, and we'll see that mostly in our yield section, but some of the other things we'll talk about as well. PTA for milk production in pounds will be mentioned as well. Reliability percent is a measure of how accurate they believe the information is based on what's in the database. If you see a UR before the name, that's really common with our bulls because they are never allowed to move a generation count forward. So that's where I was talking about that JX it can be a little confusing there, but you need to be aware that a UR in front of a bull means he is not registered, but recorded. And all of his offspring that are male will stay at a 0 generation count like he is. They will never move forward. Daughters can move up to 1st generation, but bulls will not. We don't put a lot of weight on that for PMJS because we're not typically showing cattle. Some shows, they require that the animals, the jerseys being shown, are 4th generation or better. That's really not a realm that we get into too much as homesteaders. Most of our county fairs aren't too particular. There is some more information there in that article as well. Okay, some vocabulary. Now, this gets a little confusing, but I wanted to make sure that you had a little bit of information to refer back to if you need to. So alleles are a variant form of a gene. Each gene has a specific place on the DNA strand, and different alleles can result in different observable phenotype traits, such as different coloration, for example, or our eye color is the same kind of a thing. Genotype is the chemical composition of DNA. See, I told you this is a little confusing. which gives a rise to the outward appearance. Halotype is a combination of alleles that form different genes. They are usually located close together on the same chromosome, and they tend to be inherited together. So that has to do with the inheritability of certain traits. Heterozygous, of course, that's like with POLD. They carry one of two types of alleles or two types of genes. A genotype containing one type of allele. So there's only PP, or oh, there's all kinds of traits for that, but just so that you know that means that they're homozygous, means that they're the same, essentially. Phenotype is the observable traits of an organism that are the result of the interactions of those DNA proteins. First things first, at the beginning, the top of our form, we're going to find things like the animal's registered name. We're going to find her birth date, her registration number, the tattoos or the ear tags that she has. You're going to find in the top right a little box that has that genomic inbreeding percent, the BBR, the P level. Next to her name and about in the middle of the top of the page, you'll find that JH1 and JNS. So BBR is that similarity that she has or he has with the Jersey breed reference group. P level has to do with the percentile ranking of that Jersey Performance Index, displayed as a 0 through a 9. Now, sometimes there will be nothing there and it'll be blank. Sometimes our mini jerseys will be 0. Sometimes they'll be a 1. And that can fluctuate as the year goes on because they're just comparing those animals that year. Our animals are not going to be super high producers. So to be a 0 or a 1 is about as good as we're going to see. I personally don't like to see my animals at a 1 because it may mean that I'm getting more milk or I have to give a lot more feed to keep the condition on. Genomic inbreeding, again, that was when we talked about how they inherited the same thing from their sire and their dam. Those genes get repeated, and that has to do with how close they are inbred. And typically that's going to be a negative, but it can be a positive number. PMJS at this point in time right now, we stop and cut off for registration at 12.5. And we are asking that people are careful to keep their inbreeding at 6.25% or lower. And the reason for that, it's kind of a controversial subject, but the reason for that is because we have a very small gene pool. So we want to make sure that people are actively working to make sure that their animals are not being too closely inbred to keep our gene pool as diverse as possible as we are growing the numbers across the United States for purebred mini jerseys. So it's not uncommon for a standard jersey to be 13% or even 14%, somewhere in there, depending on the herd that she's coming from. Closed herds may allow themselves to be a little bit higher, but for the purposes of what we're doing in Purebred Mini Jersey Society, we want to try to keep that as close to 6.25% as possible. And if it's 0, then great. If not, then, you know, there is some leeway in there. They are mammals, so we don't like to see a lot of inbreeding. And JNS, again, that is that neuropathy with splayed forelimbs. There's a picture there, courtesy of Ronell Visser. You can see that that calf cannot get the front legs underneath them. They cannot stand up. And this animal had to be euthanized because of that. They have to inherit it from both sides of the family line, the pedigree. So when you know you have a carrier, you do not want to breed to another carrier. All right, BBR, that is the foundation of PMJS. And the reason for that is because we want to breed miniaturized jerseys. We want pure Jersey genetics in our miniaturized jerseys. So there are 5 dairy breeds that have databases. There is not a special database for mini jerseys because they are small jerseys and all jerseys are related, right? They all came from the Isle originally, the Isle of Jersey. So what we're looking for is how close our animals are related to those known pure jerseys that came from the Isle. Any animal that gets a score, a BBR of 94 or better, that is rounded up to 100. That allows for some diversity in the gene pool. And that database was made up by specifically bulls who had been blood typed, who had known pedigrees, who had daughters who were in milk. They had a pedigree that it was at least 5 generations deep. which gives them, like it says here, 30 parents or grandparents. Any bull that had any sort of holes in that 5-generation pedigree was not used. So they were very careful about who they allowed into that database that we're testing all jerseys against now. They do update that regularly. But what you need to understand as well is that if you're working with some JX or some crossbred genetics, if you are using a mini Jersey who you suspect has maybe Galloway or Dexter or something, you're going to get a JX on your animal when it comes back because they will have identified some genetics that are not Jersey. But if they don't know that it's one of the like Holstein, Brown Swiss, Ayrshire, Guernsey, and it's an unknown, then they're going to put a JX on there specifically saying it's unknown. But say it is a cross. I know of a situation where a Guernsey Jersey were crossed and the offspring was tested through both the American Jersey Cattle Association and through the Guernsey Registration Cattle Association. And what happened there is when she tested through Guernsey, it scored higher for Guernsey. When she tested through AJCA, it tested higher for Jersey. So we know obviously be higher for both, but there's a gray area where there are some genes that don't necessarily mean Jersey or Guernsey. Those genes mean a cow. So because you're testing with the Guernsey, they would give that allowance towards Guernsey. When you test with Jersey, they'd give it towards Jersey. Not that complicated. Okay, the first section on that blue form is the index scores and yield. So remember, these terminology, this terms here are owned by the AJCA or CDCB. They are breed specific to jerseys. Most typically, like the Jersey Performance Index belongs to the AJCA, I believe. But what we need to know about that is that they take different traits and they weigh them differently. So here's a breakdown to explain how an index score is used. So they give 20% to one, 6% to another, 4% to another, 6% to one, and it all totals out to that 100%. But you can learn specifically about different indexes and how they weigh different things. That's not going to apply completely perfectly to our mini jerseys because they are proportionately smaller and because we're not going after production commercial type traits. Where this is really helpful is to be able to compare apples to apples. So say you're looking at your herd and you see one Jersey Performance Index score that's really high and one that's really low. You may decide that the one that's really low is not an animal you want to retain in your breeding program, or you may decide that she's actually the one you like better. And so you're going to start looking for her offspring that are closer to her score. So that apples to apples comparison. Say you're looking at two animals you're considering buying. You compare them to each other and get a very clear picture of who is closer to your ideal. So net merit, cheese merit, fluid merit, and grazing merit indexes. Those are all ones I believe that are owned by, I think that might even be the USDA. So grazing merit is one that Sabrina Massey has been talking about. She uses herself at Oak Spring Meadows Farm in North Carolina. She says that there are the animals that she likes to keep them because their score works really well for her. But there are also those that when they're further away from that ideal, say around -400, their grazing is not as good. They don't convert grass as well into milk, into keeping their body condition. So she needs to give them a lot more nutritional support, especially when they're in milk and they're lactating. The M on the yield section means milk. So for mini jerseys, we like to see that around a -1,000 to a -1,500. This is one of those places where a negative score is ideal for us because of what we're doing. Again, the science isn't a perfect translation, so there is a bit of a range there, and it's going to have to do with what you liked in your herd as well. I personally like to keep my herd around a -1,200. An animal that's say a -300 is going to produce a lot more milk for me than what I like to have. I'm shooting for about 3.5 gallons of milk per day with a twice-a-day milking. F and P stand for fat and protein. We like those numbers to be as high as possible. If you can find those around the negative teens, that's amazing. But for the most part, you're going to find mini jerseys are around -30 to -45. Higher fat and protein makes for better cheese, better butter. with just more fat available and more protein available for making cheeses. The next section is health and fitness. So this one is one I'm learning a lot more about and figuring out how it applies better to purebred mini jerseys. CCR is our cow conception rate. That has to do with how fertile she is, and we want those numbers to be high. Higher is better. Heifer conception rate. Heifers tend to be a little harder to conceive initially for their first few times that they're being exposed. Again, higher is better. It equates to less AI breeding, which saves you money. It equates to breeding on time. When you put her in the field with the bull, you can expect that she'll be bred when you want her to and not maybe a cycle 2 or 3 later. PL is our productive life. That's something I've been paying attention to for a while. It has to do with longevity, and it has to do with, gets a little confusing, but voluntary or involuntary culling, excuse me. So voluntary would mean that she's an animal you've decided doesn't fit into your program, or involuntary could be that she's hurt herself and has to be removed from the herd or died shortly after calving, something like that. So productive life is how long they expect that animal is going to be able to remain in the milking herd, and it correlates with some other traits as well. Livability is the genetic predictor of a cow's ability to remain alive. That is very important, right? So it correlates with a lot of other things as well. We want a higher score, that's better. And this is one, again, where you can do an apples to apples comparison to be able to figure out, but that livability has to do with specifically the involuntary culling, such as not making it through calving or dying shortly thereafter or getting hurt in the milking parlor. When we're talking about big herds, you know, they get jostled quite a bit. They can get injured. They can break a hip, those kinds of things. And that all correlates in there. Somatic cell score is one that you need to pay very close attention to. Everybody worries about mastitis and the effects it's going to have on our milk and our cow and our time. And it takes a lot of time when a cow gets sick and you have to treat her for mastitis. So somatic cell score, you want to see that ideally less than a 3.0. If you have a cow that is higher, you want to try to breed her to bulls that are going to bring that down. A lower score is better, and that means she's less likely to get mastitis, because when she gets mastitis, you're going to have to treat her typically with some antibiotics, sometimes with herbs. You can get away with it. But if it's a bad case, you may need to use antibiotics, and then your milk is going to have to be thrown out. You can't even use it in your compost because the antibiotics will ruin your good bacteria. So somatic cell score is one to pay close attention to. Conformation, which is called type on our form, on our report. PTAT is a predicted transmitting ability for type. So how likely is she going to be able to pass that on to the next generation? ST is stature. This one we pay very close attention to. A negative score of about a negative 2.0 is desirable for purebred mini jerseys. We want them to be ideally about 40 inches to 45 inches. We don't want them too small, but we also don't want them too tall. So if you've got a cow that has, let's say, a positive score of a 1.5, she's going to be taller than the average. And the average Jersey, remember we're talking about a commercial Jersey dairy herd here. So she's going to be taller than average. And it may take you a little bit longer to breed her down to be able to produce a purebred mini Jersey. You can expect a bull will take about 2 inches off per generation. It's possible he could take as much as 6, but typically it's about 2 inches. So to get that 6 inches, if you need to bring the height down on your cow 6 inches, you're going to need probably 3, maybe 4 generations. SR is strength. Now you don't want your cow to be too frail, but you also don't want her to be too strong. So typically a stronger cow is better because she's going to avoid some of those metabolic issues that Jerseys are known for, things like milk fever, ketosis. But you also want her to remain feminine, which is what Jerseys are known for. One of those beautiful things about Jerseys, because they are so graceful looking. So you want her to be a nice balance, essentially, between frail and strong. So if she's very strong, you may breed her to a bull that's going to add some more fineness to her bone. And if she is very fine, then you're going to find a bull that's going to add some more weight to her bone. Dairy form has to do with the openness of her rib, how much capacity she has, the depth of her rib. Rump angle, the RA rump angle, has to do with that slope from the hips to the pin bones on either side of her tail. Typically, you're going to be taught that that should be level. I like to see it slightly tipped down, just slightly. It should not be dramatic. It should be just a slight tip, and that has to do with the angle of the pelvis, and it makes for easier calving. Very high, if her pin bones are higher than her hip, the angle then, remember, would be an arch up and then down and out for the calf. So that is not ideal, and it can cause some issues. So you want to try to have that either level or slightly tipped down. The rear leg side view. Mini jerseys right now, they tend to be very straight legged, their rear legs. It can also be referred to as posty. So if you see a bull that is very posty, you want to be careful that you're breeding him to a cow that is slightly sickle. If you have a cow that is posty, you want to find a bull that's going to add some sickle. The reason for that is because you see how cows will jump on each other when they're in heat, or if you want to be able to live cover, even if you're using AI breeding, you want to make sure that those rear legs have some spring to them. If they're too straight and they get mounted by another cow, or if they get mounted by a bull, you'll find that they can get injured very easily. They don't have the ability to take that weight of another animal. So keep a close eye on that. See if yours are among those that are very straight, and start seeking out animals that have some sickle to their leg. You want to breed towards the mid-range. You don't want to be too sickle or too straight. But what I'm seeing right now, though, is very straight rear legs. Foot angle has to do with the angle of the foot itself. Those toes should be lined up, but they also need to be, it almost should look like they're standing on their toes. And some of that has to do with keeping their toes trimmed, but it also has to do with how low their heel is. So you want to have the proper angle. If the heel is too low, again, they can't last. It will wear out, and they'll have a lot of trouble with their feet. Strong feet are really, really important. Remember, this is a very large animal. Even with our small ones, there's a lot of weight on 4 little tiny points. So good feet are very important for longevity. Fore udder. That range can be anywhere from loose to strong, but it should ideally flow from the belly somewhat smoothly into the udder, and the udder should be fairly level. You don't want to see an udder that flows from her belly and slams into her udder like it just ran into a wall. That's not what you want to see in the fore udder. You, again, are looking for longevity, so you want her to have some good support there, and it should be very smooth and fluid back into her udder. Rear udder height, we want to have that somewhat high, and the reason for that is, again, longevity. As she goes into her peak years of production and as she ages, gravity is going to have a bit of a pull on that. So we want to start out fairly high. Rear udder width has to do with her capacity, her ability to produce. So somewhat moderate to wide is preferred. Udder cleft, we want that to be somewhat strong. Again, if it is weak, you'll notice that those rear teats are going to point outward because there's not a strong support holding them down. A dairy cow's teats should point down. We don't want them pointing forward or out to the sides. Forward, maybe some beef influence, or that her rear udder is not well supported. Udder depth, again, we want to keep that somewhat shallow. We want her to be fairly high, well supported as she's going into production, and being able to maintain that for longevity. Okay, teat placement. That has to do with how far apart specifically the front teats are. They can tend to be very wide. Rear teats can tend to be very close together to the point where they can even cross. My very first 2 cows, they crossed. So through the years as I've been breeding, I've been able to separate them and then even add a little bit of width in there. It's much easier to get the milker on. They don't rub against each other. It's just a lot easier for hand milking specifically. I've had home milked for 7 years and it was not easy. That's where teat length also comes in. You want, even if you are using machine, you still want to make sure that you're having enough teat length there to be able to hand milk if needed. These are homestead cows for the most part, and they need to be able to function on a homestead, which may mean that you're selling to people who are off grid, who aren't going to be using a milker at all, or people who don't want to invest in a milker. They can be pretty expensive. Jersey Udder Index, that's another index score we talked about where it's a composite of different things, specifically these traits that we've just discussed. And that's great for that apples to apples comparison, but our cows are never going to compare very well, honestly, with a commercial Jersey from a dairy. Their goals are slightly different than ours. Wellness is something new that's been added. It has to do with their longevity again, but also some of the things that Jerseys are known for that can be a problem. Milk fever, it has to do with the calcium being low in the blood. It's called hypocalcemia. And these scores will tell you how likely she is to have issues with those particular problems. Displaced abomasum, which is when the abomasum fills with gas or fluid and it floats around in the abdominal cavity and can float up and get a twist to it. The vet will need to be called if that happens. If you suspect that, get the vet out immediately. The digestion process is blocked, and she's going to need to have that abomasum put back where it belongs and stitched into place so that it doesn't keep recurring, because it will. Ketosis is a buildup of ketone bodies due to negative energy balance. That's where she starts losing weight condition really quickly after she comes into milk, because she can't put enough calories into her body because she's using all of her calories to produce milk. Mastitis, we talked about that score earlier with the somatic cell score. This is another score for mastitis. It is infectious, and so this tells us how likely she is to be able to resist those things, those different kinds of infections that cause mastitis. Metritis is an infection of the endometrium, which is a lining of the uterus after calving. It is something, again, you would want to get a vet out for, but knowing these scores kind of gives you an idea before she calves of what you're going to be watching for. Retained placenta, that happens usually anything that goes past 24 hours after calving. Again, you're going to need a vet for this. So all of these wellness traits help you figure out how to save money on taking care of her. And if you've got a cow that's scoring really poorly in all of these areas, she's going to be very expensive to maintain and hard to keep alive. So that health traits index is all of these scores, again, in another index where they've got different weights and they give you a number to be able to figure out if that animal is going to be more likely to be a problem and an expense for you. You can find these specifically. They're not going to be on that blue form. They're going to be on the official performance pedigree and progeny report. That white one, when we look animals up in Info Jersey, that's where you're going to find these. The PTAs for these have to do with, remember, how their inheritability is for their daughters specifically. And then the larger the positive value, the better it is, the more likely she is to avoid these issues. And you can learn more about it in that last article there. Okay, so this is how I'm applying some of these numbers to my herd, because healthier cows live longer. They'll give more milk over the length of their life, and they have more calves, and calves are money. Even if you intend to keep some of your calves, then they're producing calves. We all end up selling calves at some point in time, and that is a great source of income for our homesteads. So somatic cell score, I mentioned, I need to see that in my own herd below 3.0. And I keep my shelters cleaned at least twice daily. We all pitch in here on the homestead. And I don't really have any issues with mastitis because my scores are low and because we've taken the step of making sure our shelters are clean. So when our cows lay down, they're not getting mud near their teats. Another thing you can do for that is after they've been milked, to give them about 30 minutes on their feet before they lay down, so the sphincters of their teats close. If you've got a cow that leaks, specifically after she's calved, maybe even a few days later or a few days before. Leaking at calving is pretty normal, but too early or too late means that those sphincters are kind of loose. And so you're going to want to try to keep an eye on keeping her shelters very, very clean and finding bulls that their dams don't leak. Really important. I don't have cows that leak anymore. I did with my first two. They were, again, many generations ago at this point, but having tight sphincters means that you don't have as many issues with mastitis. So it's really important. Keep them on their feet and give the sphincters a time to close back down after milking. Those little yellow and black mastitis cards, you can use that. So you hold your thumb on the top white portion, and then you milk with the other hand, all 4 quarters on all 4 corners. And if any of them were to turn green or blue, green means you're going to have an issue with mastitis if you don't deal with it now. And blue means you have an issue, and it is definitely time to start figuring out how to treat that immediately. So just as a quick little catch, to be able to test periodically. Say you've had a calf that has been nursing for a while and you want to go back to milking, or you see a cow that maybe one of her udder or one of the quarters of her udder doesn't look as well milked out, then you could check that. They're just handy to be able to use right at the barn. Another thing I do is I look at my herd as a total, and you can do that when you go into that info jersey underneath Genomics. You can see the official report, and it will show you your whole herd, and you can sort that out by the different traits. So I can sort it by cow conception rate, heifer conception rate, fat, milk, protein, any of those things. Any of the animals on my report that I see are consistently scoring low in a lot of areas, those are typically going to be the next animal I offer for sale. Now, what that would mean is that for my particular herd, for my particular goals, that she is not meeting my desired median, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's not a great cow. She could be better than somebody else's cow in their herd, or maybe not. But those scores give us that kind of idea. And so what I started using Genomics for was to figure out the animals in my herd that were in the lowest 10%. So I'd look at 10 cows and I'd figure out which one is at the bottom, and she would be the next one I would sell. And then I would specifically select bulls that are going to improve the cows that I retained, so that each generation is an improvement upon the last. And then again, I would look at my total cows and I would look at their score, and I'm always moving forward, always trying to be better, always trying to have cows that are less expensive to maintain, and cows that are going to be healthier for longevity. Just always looking to be better and do better and have easier cows to maintain on the homestead. It's gotten very expensive to get a vet to come out. And if I have cows that don't need a vet as often, and that's the ideal, of course. Okay, got a little bonus section for you. So before we had Genomics, there was, you could call them old wives' tales, but really they are so much more used than especially previously. But it's looking at your cow and looking for certain things about her, or your bull, things that are there that you have to train your eye to see. So linear measurement indicators for a fertile cow, and these were things that were shared with me from tailormadecattle.com. So if she has a bigger belly than the herd average, so she's got that nice big rib spring open cage, right? Open rib cage, some depth. If she's wider from the rear, so her pin bones next to her tail aren't set quite as close, she's got some space in there, she's going to calve easier. So that's what he meant by a wider butt than the average of the herd. And he says the most important of the 3 is that slope that we talked about, where the pins are slightly lower. So those are cows that are going to be really fertile and have really easy calving, breed back really easily. The importance of teats on a bull. That could be a joke, but it's really not. It's super important, and it's something that I've been watching very closely in my own herd. The position and the shape of those teats will reflect what he puts onto his daughters. So a bull puts his dam's udder on his daughters, and we can get a clue of that if, for example, you can't see the dam and you're looking at a bull, you want to see where those teats are. You want them to be high up, ideally on the body cavity, like on his belly. You don't want to see the scrotum hanging loose and sloppy, hanging low, even on a warm day. You don't want it to be super, super low. You never want to see teats on the neck of the scrotum. It's going to put some pretty sloppy udders on his daughters. Signs of high butter fat, a bald udder. So if she doesn't have a bunch of hair on her udder naturally, you're going to want to ask if that's been scorched. Sometimes a hoof trimmer or a vet will even scorch it and burn the hair off to make for a cleaner milking. It's very common in dairy herds. I don't do that because I want to be able to see a bald udder naturally. Vertical folds on the hide, especially along the neck and along the sides. Shorter bones with a smaller diameter makes for finer meat, and also it makes for higher butter fat. Facial hair whorls. So that's that kind of swirl in the middle of her face. And it goes for bulls too. You want to see that centered. And I had to recently be corrected. I had remembered it wrong, but you want to see it centered, the swirl, and slightly lower than her eyes. If you find that that whorl is very high, up higher than her eyes, up on her forehead, real high, back towards her poll, it can mean that she's going to be a little flightier, a little more reactive when you're trying to work with her or train her for milking. If it's off to the side to the left, she's going to be a little more emotional, maybe kind of sensitive. And if it's to the right, she may be more, she may be smart. She may kind of hang back a little bit and kind of watch, be a little more rational, more observant of what's going on in the herd. You may even find that she's a bit of a loner. Okay, so you can learn more about these tips and tricks kind of bovine engineering from Gerald Fry, who has now passed away. He's from the American Herbivorist, or you can read the book Herd Bull Fertility by James Drayson. And then again, tailormadecattle.com. He will actually come to different parts of the United States and teach how to be able to look at your herd and, excuse me, determine some of these things. And I'm sure there's loads more that we can learn about this, but I kind of wanted to just remind you that numbers are important, but we also need to use that with the observations of what we see in our herd. So when you see a negative milk score of maybe negative 2,000, and she's putting what you want to see in her milk pail, then I wouldn't necessarily call her. There's some variation within there, and there's your own personal preferences. Thank you. Thank you for taking time to come and listen to me talk. I hope that you found it helpful. I hope that you find that Genomics report isn't quite as intimidating as it was before, and that some of those terms, you become comfortable enough to start using them. Specifically, if you need help with ordering the Genomics report, please reach out to anyone on the Pure Bred New Jersey Society Board of Directors. They are all willing to help. I'm willing to help. Send a message through PMJS. You can do that through any of our social media or email or through the website. Thank you again.